Hi everyone. Okay, so in this lesson, which is part of the series relating to the IELTS academic writing task 1 episode, we're going to be looking at comparing numbers. Before we actually get on to comparing one number with another number though, I think it's important for us to be able to talk about numbers individually. And first of all, I just want to perhaps do a quick review. Now, I'm going to presume that most of you guys are intelligent enough to understand the difference between a percentage and a fraction, and you can probably work these out yourself, but I just want to quickly go over these with you, okay? So, percentages. Well, we're probably all very familiar with percentages. 10%, 25%, 50%. But these numbers here can also be represented as a fraction. So these fractions are words that you will also be familiar with. This is an unusual one. 10% is 1/10. And to say something is 1/10 is not a very natural way of describing something, but I've got that one there just to demonstrate that 10% is also a fraction. Now, the others you're probably more familiar with. For example, 25% is also known as a quarter. 50% is known as a half. 75% is 3/4. Okay. Now, 33% and 66%, these are quite interesting because we have a third or 2/3. Okay. And down here, last but not least, we have 20%, which is known as a fifth. Okay. So obviously, every number between 1 and 100 will have a corresponding fraction. But we generally only use the major ones like 25, 50, 75, 33, 66 and 20. Yeah? If you are a genius at math, you can probably work out the fraction of, let's say, 23.2%. You can probably work that out as a fraction, but the fraction will be very strange and not natural to use. So we're probably just going to use, in fact, let me cross those out because I don't want you to use, 1/10. What I want you to be thinking about are the major numbers, yeah, and their corresponding fractions, which is great vocabulary, okay? It's great vocabulary because you may get a chart or a graph or any kind of diagram that has lots of percentages on it. And it's very useful, instead of you talking about percentages all the time, sometimes you can then very easily convert some of those percentages into fractions to help you change the vocabulary that you're using, which is a very useful skill. So instead of saying 50% of the people went to private school and 50% of the people went to public school, you might say 50% of the people went to private school, but the other half went to a public school. Yeah? So you can change your vocabulary, okay? And that's one of the key skills to helping you achieve a great score in your IELTS, using different vocabulary to describe the same things. Yep. Okay, so percentages and fractions. Now, another one of the skills that I want you guys to practice is I want you to stop being too precise with your numbers. Yeah? So, for example, okay, 75%, we know that is 3/4, but probably in the information you're given, this number will not be precisely 75%. It might be 74.3%. It might be 77%. Yeah. And you don't necessarily need or want to say 77% of people or whatever. Yeah. What you want to do, or what you want to learn to do and practice doing, is talking in round numbers. Round your numbers either up or down to one of the nearest sort of, major numbers. Okay? Not all the time. Sometimes you do need to be precise, but in most cases you can get away with just being very general about it. Okay? And here is some great vocabulary to allow you to do that. So we can say around 25%, or we can say around 1/4 of people. Okay. Slightly more than or slightly less than is another great way of doing it. So perhaps you have, I don't know, let's say you have a number here that is 74%. So that is not exactly 3/4. So you can say slightly less than 3/4 or slightly less than 75%. Alternatively, just under or just over 66%. Okay. Almost is another great one. So let's imagine that you're working, you've had a quick look and you've seen that perhaps you could say, let's say you've got 63%, which is almost 2/3. Yeah, almost 2/3 of people chose the colour blue as their favourite. Yeah, that's a great one. Well over, that's another one of my favourites. So, I don't know, well over. Let's take this figure here, 66%. That is well over a half. Here's a half, which is 50%. This is well over a half. Okay? And another great phrase that you can use, the total. Instead of saying all, you can say the total. Yeah? Okay, so these are we've just done a quick refresher or reminder on percentages and fractions. Remember to change and mix your vocabulary. Talk about some percentages and talk about some fractions. Mix your vocabulary. Try not to be too precise with your numbers. It's okay to be precise, very precise, extremely precise, perhaps with one number if you think it's important. But in general, you want to talk about round numbers. Almost 75%, just over 50%, around 25%. That's the kind of vocabulary and the way of describing these numbers which will get you a high score. Okay, so please make a note of this vocabulary. Now let's look at how we are going to actually compare one figure with another. So when we are comparing numbers, yeah, now there is a ton of different vocabulary that you can use, but when you're making your comparisons, you don't necessarily need an extensive range of vocabulary. Okay, so I've got here probably some standard words and phrases that you're probably already familiar with already, which you can use very easily and very efficiently to and very effectively to compare numbers. So we have more than, less than, greater than, smaller than, higher than, lower than. Yeah? More, less, greater, smaller, higher and lower. Each of them is followed by than. When we are comparing, when we're using these, we have to use than. This number is higher than that number. Okay? But what we can do with these standard words or standard phrases is just make them a little bit better with the addition of one or two extra pieces of vocabulary. And again, there are a lot of choices out there. I have just chosen 3, which I think would probably suit most of you most of the time. Much, slightly and just. Okay? And we can very easily use much, slightly and just with either of these. Bear in mind that your comparisons that you're going to be making, you'll perhaps make 2, maybe 3 comparisons in your task 1 of your IELTS. So you're not going to be reusing this vocabulary. You might make one slightly higher than comparison, followed by just less than comparison, and a much greater than comparison. Okay, you have compared 3 things using 3 different pieces of vocabulary, and that is very, very effective in the IELTS. You don't need tons and tons of vocabulary. You just need some good basic vocabulary to help you describe these things. Let's take a look at some examples. So we have some numbers. These numbers don't really mean anything, okay? So 500 compared to 300. So we can say 500 is greater than 300, but we can also say 500 is much greater than 300. We can also say 300 is much smaller than 500. We can also say it is 300 is much less than 500. Okay? Let's look at a more complicated one. 374 and 396. So these numbers are closer together. So we probably wouldn't use much in this case. We might want to use slightly. This is slightly higher than this number. This number is slightly less than that number. Okay? So slightly, much, and these phrases are great. Okay, let's have a look at just. What do we use just for? Okay, just is when we're talking about small differences. So is 374 to 396 a small difference or is it a big difference? It depends on the context. For me, this could be a small difference. If you're talking about thousands, this is possibly just a small difference. So 396 could be just about higher than 374. It could be just greater than 374. Yeah? Okay, you might not have numbers, specific numbers, you might have percentages, or you might have fractions, as we mentioned earlier. So we've got 33% and 76% here. Yeah? So, I don't know, is 76% slightly more than 33%? Slightly more? No, because slightly is just a small amount, and this is percentage. So we can see there is a big difference here. Okay? So slightly doesn't quite work. Much more than, much higher than, and much greater than certainly work for this. This is much more than, much greater than, and much higher than this number. And alternatively, this number, okay, is much less, smaller, or lower. Yeah? Does that make sense? I hope it does. So remember that when you are comparing your numbers, you do not need tons and tons and tons of vocabulary. You just need to be able to use the vocabulary that you have already effectively. Okay? But we're not finished yet. Now we're going to take a look at using the superlative. Okay, so we're back with some more vocabulary, which again we can use this vocabulary for comparing numbers, but these are really superlatives. These are when we're talking about the majority, the most. We're not comparing numbers like for like. We're talking about the biggest numbers that we're given. Yeah. So we have phrases like the majority of something, most, which is a very, very simple word. Well over, we spoke about well over before, but we can use well over to talk about well over 3/4 of people preferred option C, whatever option C is. Option C is far greater than any other. More than twice the amount of, or perhaps even nearly all. Again, this is not all of the vocabulary, but this is a good proportion of some of the vocabulary that you will need to help you practice and to write a good essay. Yeah. Let's just take a look. Okay, here's a very, very simple chart. A, B, C, 10, 20, 30. Okay, so we can easily see the majority of people preferred option C. Okay, most preferred option C. Well over half of the people preferred option C. Option C is far greater than options A and B combined. Far greater than, we also use option C, or more people preferred C, which is actually twice the amount of A and B. So option C is more than twice the amount of A and B put together. And another one, nearly all people preferred option C. Okay? So when you are comparing numbers, you have to remember to compare kind of like for like here. Okay? But then you're also contrasting with numbers that are completely different in that aspect. Yeah? So you need your comparatives, more than, less than, greater than, higher than. But you also need some good superlatives to help you describe this one over here. Yeah? Okay, so we've spoken today about describing numbers, how to help you describe numbers in their comparative forms and in their superlative forms. So get practicing, okay? Practice makes perfect.